think this time we are finally live, and I hope we're live. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. We had a little bit of technical difficulty. But you guys, we are here Saturday, 24 hours before Week 7 NFL main slate lock. Chris Randone, my wonderful co-host Sal Vitri. Good morning, Sal. How you doing, man?
Good, man. Yeah, take two. I'm having a good time. Saturday morning right now. We're getting into the early afternoon, about a 24-hour window until lock. So, yeah, how's your Saturday going?
It's good, man. You know, I'm not going to lie. I kind of like the take two because it gave us a little warm-up, a little pregame. Sometimes you got to get out the kinks and get the swagger going. So, you know, I'm okay with that. But, yeah, you know, before we get into this, guys, as you know, Sal and I, we go into ownership. We go into injuries. We break down the main slate, really just getting into our final thoughts before we go ahead and finalize our lineups for tomorrow. But before we do, let's go ahead and thank our wonderful sponsor, Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports. You guys, if you haven't signed up for Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports yet, there is a code to go ahead and get Yahoo Daily Rewards points, which will allow you to get into 3 entries into the $250,000 baller tournament. And this is important because this is the last week of doing hand building. So come next week, they're doing CSV uploading. We'll probably see a lot more strength of players get involved. So you guys, 25 grand up top. Use the code AWESEMO, AWESEMO, to go ahead and get involved, guys. And that'll get you 3 free entries into that tournament. All right, Week 7. We're here. Earlier on the show, we were talking about the Green Bay injuries with Geronimo Allison, you know, being doubtful and not really going through the concussion protocol. Devontae Adams is out, as we know. And this is going to thin up the wide receiver core. So to start off our injuries, I guess we're going to go into the Green Bay Packers first, because there is a play here that we saw on Monday night against Detroit. Lazard, he's the minimum price right now, and this could shift ownership, especially for cash games, for him to be just a plug-and-play type of guy at that price point. So, Sal, if you can, let's break down this situation with Allison being doubtful. And, I mean, who's going to be the guy that they're going to call up? And is Lazard a must-play now?
Yeah, so I don't expect Allison to sustain a concussion and a chest injury on the exact same play. So that being said, he's probably not going to suit up. So I think the true game time decision is MVS. MVS is not a possession receiver. He's what he did last week, a 46-yard reception. He's just a deep threat type of guy, a burner. So I think either way, the possession receiver in this game who has upside down the field, like we saw last week, is Allen Lazard. He's a 6'5" physical receiver, a guy that Rodgers hyped up the entire preseason. He was on the bubble to make the team. And he put in multiple times positive comments for him. Never said a single thing about Darius Shepard. So going into this game, yeah, if Allison misses, I think Lazard's still in play, even with MVS out there. But obviously, if you want MVS out, if you want to play Lazard, because if you do project a guy like Aaron Rodgers to throw the ball, say, 30 times in a game where they're 4.5-point favorites, and they're not playing from behind like last week when he had to throw 39 times. I think the way that you split it up, once you're giving targets to the running backs around 10 or so, some to the tight ends, I think you do get Lazard in a range of about 6 to 7 targets if there's no MVS. And yeah, $3,000, the physical specimen that he is, 6'5", and he's going to be their main red zone target, even if MVS is out there. Yeah, I like it. I like it a lot. If MVS is out, I think it's cash viable. If MVS is out, don't feel as good about it if MVS is in there for cash, but definitely GPP either way.
Currently right now, Lazard on DraftKings per Osmos projections. And this was the last update was 16 hours ago. So obviously there are going to be changes made today when the new update comes in, but 9.2% already. And so that's going to be interesting now with the news becoming more and more clear. Seeing that rise is going to be very interesting because, I mean, if he does stay low, would you say that this is more of a must play then rather than it being kind of the chalk where everyone's getting involved, especially if they're doing it in GBPs?
Yeah, if MVS is out, it's close to a must play if he's not chalk. Yeah, so like the end of the day here is you can feel good projecting this guy for around 10 fantasy points as like a median projection, and that's with a lot of systems just right now keeping in MVS for somewhere around the same amount of fantasy points. So yeah, it's not like MVS has been this true number one. He's for the most part like a number 3 wide receiver on most teams. Even if MVS plays, I think Lazard is, as a Packers fan and not trying to have a hot take from the one night following him since the preseason, with Adams out, I think he's still the Packers' best wide receiver. It's just a matter of if LaFleur actually feeds him those types of targets, and we'll have a lot more clarity on that if indeed at 11:30 tomorrow MVS is ruled out. So in cash, yeah, I would plug him in there if MVS is out. In tournaments, if the ownership is low, it's going to be hard for me personally to get away from a good amount of him.
Our next injury that is now officially out, Alvin Kamara, running back of the New Orleans Saints. They got a tough matchup this week, obviously, against the Chicago Bears. But the next man up that's going to give way is Latavius Murray. Does this injury, really kind of change anything as far as perception with wanting to roster someone in this game? Or does this increase Michael Thomas's stock as far as getting more target shares? How do you feel about this injury, and break this down?
Yeah, so in terms of Michael Thomas, I think it gives him the most upside because both Kamara and Jared Cook now, probably the two options behind Michael Thomas in the receiving game, are gone. It's just a matter if you want to pay up for Michael Thomas's price tag. I probably still don't get there too much, but his opportunity, the offense has to go through him. But you imagine that the Bears defense also knows that. So if anything, this makes me like the Bears defense a little bit more when two of your three top probably weapons in the passing game are out in Kamara and Cook. I don't really have much interest in Latavius Murray. We know it's a brutal matchup. Murray's not the type of weapon in the receiving game that Kamara is, nowhere near it. And then also you factor in the context of the slate. You have guys like Josh Jacobs, Joe Mixon, Kerryon Johnson, and potentially even Chase Edmonds opening up for a cheaper price point or similar price point. I'd rather all those guys over Latavius Murray in this matchup. If you have him in season long, yeah, plug and play him. But for DFS, they've already priced him up to a point where I don't really want him on this slate.
Yeah, the over-under 38.5. As we know, we've seen Chicago's run D, except we saw Josh Jacobs kind of exploit, I guess we can say, some weaknesses, in that London game. However, though, this is Latavius Murray. I wouldn't say that this is someone of the same caliber as far as talent as Kamara. But I mean, he is cheap, so it becomes a little bit interesting in some ways if you want to get a little, I guess, cute in your lineup constructions if you're multi-entering. But I mean, outside of that, yeah, I mean, regardless of the situation, I think it comes down to Mike Thomas benefiting the most. But outside of that, I mean, once again, it's an ugly game. So not much to say when it comes to wanting the desire to roster someone. Another interesting injury that's, I guess he's officially out now, is Malcolm Brown. And I say this because this is a big game as far as a lot of talent, a high total. Todd Gurley is going to be playing. He's not listed on the report. But as we know, what we've seen this year with the running game with Todd Gurley, just maybe not the same. He's got a great matchup this week against the Falcons. And so I wanted to ask you, with Todd Gurley, does Darrell Henderson become any of interest in this matchup?
Yeah, so with Gurley off the injury report, probably not for me. I had Henderson in a player pool when Gurley was still like on Monday or Tuesday, not sure what his status was going to be, even if Malcolm Brown was playing. So yeah, the direct backup probably going into this game is going to be Henderson. We know he is the reason they drafted him. He's sort of a pace up spot. He can catch the ball on third downs. But the last time that Gurley did play healthy, 93% of the snaps, I doubt it's that high this week. But I also doubt they're going to put him out there if he is really dealing with this injury. So the fact that he wasn't on the practice report, I think it's enough for me not to want to get there. The price point's nice on Henderson, but there's a really good chance he plays 15, 20% of the snaps at most.
Do we see Gurley maybe getting more touches than usual with Brown out? Because obviously they had this scheme early on in the season where they were splitting drives, where Todd Gurley would be on one drive and then we would see Malcolm Brown on the next and maybe Malcolm Brown on the next after. So it was kind of a weird situation with the way that they were distributing carries from week to week. Things always seem to change. And so do we see that this week with the game plan, you think, as far as Darrell Henderson getting a drive, Gurley getting a drive, and switching off vice versa?
I think it'll be primarily Gurley there. I think if you were to project maybe like 10 drives in this game for them, you probably see something of a 7-3 split for Gurley, maybe even an 8-2, depending on how healthy he actually is. So yeah, the price point on Gurley is actually interesting for this matchup against Atlanta. It's just a matter of how much faith you have in his health. And so far this year, people haven't been taking that, and that's probably the smart spot to stay. But the price is getting to a point where he's almost in the 5K range. He's tilting that way closer than he is to 7K. So it's interesting to watch if he doesn't perform this week, what his price point jumps to or reduces to, really.
Gurley, week 5 against I think it was Seattle. He got 93% of the snaps. Weeks 1 through 4, he was playing just a little bit over 70%. So, it was about a 70-30 split. Week 5, for some reason, was in there almost 100% of the time, seemed to be getting a ton of looks, and then obviously goes down with an injury. So I'm just curious to see how he bounces back here. Do they kind of just are they cautious with him, or does he get a heavy workload? And if he does get a heavy workload, I think it becomes a great play, especially with his price point, like you mentioned. And also, I mean, 5% projected ownership right now in Awesome's projections. So could be a unique situation. Another running back that's questionable, and we're still trying to figure this out, is David Johnson, who is projected to be highly owned. How do we feel about this injury? And is Chase Edmonds someone who we can kind of start looking at a little bit more, given what we've seen over the last couple of weeks?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, Chase Edmonds in limited roles the last couple of weeks of last week, 29% of the snaps or 30%, still able to perform. The week before, scores a long touchdown from outside the red zone. Yeah, David Johnson, it's a little bit concerning. They said if the game was going to be played on a Friday, which we all know that's not the case, but if it was, David Johnson wouldn't have suited up. So it's a new injury. It's not this back injury. It's an ankle injury. He did practice. He didn't practice Wednesday. Then he practices Thursday. Then he doesn't practice Friday. And they're saying that he wouldn't have played on Friday if there was a game. So David Johnson says he feels good and he's hoping that he can play. That's what he's telling the media. His coach is telling him another thing. So it's just a true game time decision. We saw this happen last week. David Johnson ends up being ruled in. I think Adam Schefter overnight tweeted that he was going to be in. So I'm going to approach it the same way. If David Johnson is ruled in overnight or at 11:30, I'm just assuming that he's going to be a full go like he did last week when he had his best game of the year. And if he's ruled out, well, then, yeah, it's just Chase Edmonds weeks below $5,000. Just a really good matchup and a guy who's already produced, and we know his role this year. You would expect probably somewhere at least around 70+% of the snaps for Edmonds. And at that price point, he would just become the best running back play below Leonard Fournette, if not the best overall.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go with the Chris Godwin narrative that we saw a few weeks back where people were so scared to roster him. So everyone went on Evans in that matchup against the Rams. And the way I'm moving forward is if they're listed as playing, I'm just going to play them. I'm not going to have any fear in rostering anyone, especially when they have talent like David Johnson, especially in the matchup that he has this weekend at New York. So yeah, I agree with you. If he's there and they're listing him as active, I'm not going to go ahead and shy away from him just because he was questionable on the injury report all week.
Yeah, I completely agree. And then if you're just somebody who's too scared to like maybe take that as gospel and don't want to still play a player like that, if you're wondering about a guy like Christian Kirk, who's also in a good spot, good price, he's going to be a game time decision. But you could feel really confident that if Christian Kirk plays, he's going to be a full go.
Our last guy is from the same team.
Oh, did I cut out?
Oh yeah, I think it's all good. I was going to say our last guy is from the same team, Sal, that we'll go over on the injury report, Christian Kirk. And I want to bring up Kirk because obviously when he is on the field, he's been heavily involved with Kyler Murray. And they have a dream matchup this weekend with this weak, inexperienced defensive secondary of the Giants. And so the only thing that frustrates me about the Cardinals is they do such short dump off passes and slants for 5-6 yards that you're not getting those big, I guess, air yard targets that we look for in wideouts or big plays, I guess you could say. But Kirk does provide that upside. Kirk is someone who can definitely, give you that opportunity. If there's anything change as far as if Kirk is out again, is everyone going to, I guess, navigate to the chalk Larry Fitzgerald, which I feel is the overrated move now?
Yeah, if Kirk is out again, I'm sure more people go on that. The only upside, yeah, he'll probably become even more chalky in Fitzgerald, and the price point's still at a favorable spot at 6,100, but a lot more expensive than Kirk at 5K. The only upside if Kirk is out for Fitzgerald is like he doesn't leave the slot in general, but he won't leave the slot, and he'll be facing the guy Grant Haley, who's given up the most slot receiving yards on the year and has just been absolutely abysmal when targeted, over 120 passer rating against. So there's upside there. Whereas if Kirk does play and they go a lot more 4 wide receiver sets, then there'll be 4 wide receiver sets for like 80+% of the game or right around there. Then you're gonna have Grant Haley on one of them, and you don't know which one it is, and then Janoris Jenkins will come into the slot because that's the only other guy who can guard slot receivers on the Giants right now. So Kirk, you feel good about Kirk if he actually plays. Like you should know that he's going to play and be 100% because Kingsbury has said multiple times so far this week that we're not letting him play out there if he's not 100%. He's been able to cut, but not to the full extent. That was the last news on Friday. So if he's in there, you would imagine then that they stuck to that word and he'll be 100%. So yeah, if Kirk's out, I do like the spot for Fitzgerald. I do think that it's very just probably still touchdown dependent for him because the defense knows that he's the one threat in the receiving game, especially if David Johnson's out. So a lot of moving pieces for Arizona. Just keep an eye on the injury report. And if people are going to be playing on this team, I would just expect them to be a full go.
Larry Fitzgerald right now, Sal, 26.1% projected ownership on FanDuel. A little bit different on DraftKings where he's at 11%. And I would think that it would be the reversal of this because obviously PPR is more effective on DraftKings. And Larry Fitzgerald seems to be getting, those 6, 7, 8 yard slants, those short dump off passes, which is more valuable on DraftKings compared to FanDuel. So if Kirk is out yet again, I mean, I think this ownership rises on DraftKings, but it would be interesting to see, does he even rise even more on FanDuel? All right, guys, we're going to go into our favorite part of this show. I know for a lot of you is the DFS ownership projections for DraftKings and FanDuel, where Sal and myself kind of just talk about the top projected own guys for each slate. And so, Sal, before we get into this, let's go ahead and remind everyone, you guys, give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that red button, share, get the notifications, so that way you guys know when you're alerted each day of the live streams and you're prepared for each show. And also, it helps us. It helps us grow. And also, without you guys, we can't continue doing content. So we appreciate you guys with your support and with your interaction and involvement, because it plays a huge, huge role with us continuing to produce content, guys. All right, so we're going to go to DraftKings first, Sal. We'll go over the first 4 or 5 guys that are in the 20s here. And for DraftKings, there's only 4 guys right now that are 20% or higher projected ownership. First guy, which I think we're going to both be in agreement here. Leonard Fournette, 7K, matchup at Cincinnati, 37% projected ownership, Sal. And I want you to break this down, because a lot of people are saying that if he continues to stay this high or get higher, I saw you over the chat over the last couple of days, is this a week where you fade Fournette?
Fade him. No. I mean, never going to fade him like a full fade, but in terms of like going under or over that 37%, right now I would want to go over it by a good amount. This is as good of a spot as it gets for a guy who should be $1,000 more expensive. Most fantasy points against, I know that's kind of a swayed stat this early in the year, but they're giving up the second most receptions, most receiving touchdowns, second most rushing yards. Right now, they're just getting absolutely decimated on the ground. Is this Bengals team? They're not going to have Carl Lawson again. Last time I checked, Carlos Dunlap does not seem like he's going to be suiting up, so their front's even worse. Yeah, it's a bad spot overall for the Cincinnati defense against Fournette, who's running the most routes in the league. He has just over 25 attempts per game, or 25 over opportunities per game right now. It's a really good spot for a guy who's also due for some touchdown regression, and he's only $7,000. So what does he have to do for you if he does come in at 40% owned? And I don't think it'll hit the point of 50+% owned. If it does, then maybe you start talking about just taking a really strong stance on it. But if he's going to come in at 37% like we have him at right now, I do think that that's a number that I do want to get over. What does he have to do for you? I mean, in a GPP, is he a guy that you think can score 20 for you? Yes, we've seen him do it multiple times. This is a spot where I think Leonard Fournette, if the game script plays out as I expect it to, it's a spot where he probably sees his second 30-touch game of the year. So, yeah, I like Fournette. It's an obviously great spot. If you want to come in and take a strong stance and have 10% of him and however many lineups you play, I'm not going to say you're totally wrong. Yeah, you're being completely contrarian, but I think this is very good chalk and the best spot of the year for a running back who is being utilized very similar, if not better right now than Christian McCaffrey, just not producing the same way. So yeah, it's a spot that I'm not going to get away from right now unless we see some crazy number come Sunday morning.
I think one thing to point out here is when there's good chalk and when there's bad chalk. And Leonard Fournette is by far probably some of the best chalk I've ever seen, especially on this week. And you have to understand the difference is the fact that you mentioned, I mean, running the most routes, getting passing targets, also heavily involved just in almost every snap possible. I mean, he's being utilized in more ways than we could think of for a running back. Him and McCaffrey are going toe-to-toe as far as volume when it comes to the running back position. But also it's the fact that it's like you said, his price point. He doesn't have to do much. And when you're getting that many looks and that many opportunities and that many touches in the game, you almost have to be so confident to know that he's going to get there somehow, especially against a defense that's fairly weak against that position. And so this is good chalk. What's bad chalk is when you have like a Lazard, if he's 37%, where it's very uncertain, not guaranteed that he'll get looks. It's more of a gamble. I would say that this is more of an educated play, because we kind of know the game script. We kind of know the scheme for Jacksonville now 6 weeks into this, and we understand the volume that he's getting. And I mean, to be honest with you, 37%, in my opinion, is fairly low. I think it's a lock. I think it's a no-brainer. And it's hard to shy away from that because, once again, it's not like the only thing I said it yesterday to Manny. I said, if you're fading Fournette, you're hoping for an injury.
Yeah. You're either hoping for an injury or just something crazy to happen. Like the best defensive line players for this team are going to remain out. So like the only chance that the worst run defense in the league, or I guess bottom 3 run defense in the league right now, bottom 2 actually, in the league is going to stop Fournette on 25+ opportunities. It's really hard to imagine that. But yeah, I understand why people want to get away from it. It's because everybody's hyping it up, but they're hyping it up for a reason. There's weeks where people get hyped up, and you see somebody in the industry saying this is a bad play. It's all across the industry right now. It's a spot that I think you go overweight here, and that's what I'll personally do. And yeah, it's a fantastic spot at $7,000. It's not too expensive at all.
Yeah, I think you'll see Fournette in a lot of cash lineups. So if you're playing cash, expect to go against him if you're fading him. And I think if you're playing higher price tournaments, outside of the Millie Maker or the slant or those short, small dollar tournaments, expect ownership to be high. So, yeah, I mean, if you want to be cute, you can definitely go ahead and fade him. Do I think it's smart? Not necessarily. Do I think if you're multi-entering, you can leave him out in some lineups? Absolutely. However, though, great situation, great spot for Fournette, and I think everyone sees that, and that's what's justifying his high ownership at 37% on DraftKings. Cooper Kupp is the next highest projected owned player, Sal, at 22.3% on DraftKings, 7,400 price tag, going into a very good matchup in Atlanta with that weak secondary, and that's been getting torched a lot this year by slot receivers. How do we feel about Cooper Kupp at this 22.3% ownership projection?
Yeah, I like it a lot. Look, it's really up to his quarterback, and his quarterback shouldn't face that much pressure this week. Atlanta's bottom half of the league in pressure rate. He's going to get to go up against DeMonte Casey in the slot. Casey's given up on 18 targets this year, 14 receptions, 174 yards, and a touchdown. He hasn't faced anyone near the skill set of Cooper Kupp. So you're getting a guy in Casey right now, 126 passer rating against. It's just a fantastic spot. The only guy worse on the team right now, outside, not considering the slot, is Desmond Trufant, and he's not going to be playing in this game. So Casey's going to be the worst cornerback on the field. He primarily lives in the slot. He's their primary slot defender. Now Cooper Kupp's going to go up against him. And honestly, Cooper Kupp's price point at 7,400, we're talking about a guy in Fournette being cheap at 7K. Just because it's a different position, that's still a favorable price point, in my opinion, for cash, for GPP formats. And in a game where you're going to get a lot of ownership on this Atlanta and Rams game for good reason, he's a cornerstone piece of it. And we'll talk about it in a second, but just game stacking it 4 or 5 guys will let you naturally get different. So yeah, Kupp's ownership at 22%. I'm completely fine with that.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of passing in this game. And obviously, these 3 guys, whether it's Kupp, Cooks, or Woods, I think they're all in play. So I think it's a fair assessment to say that rostering any one of these guys is definitely the right approach, because I think we're going to see a heavy passing game from Goff, especially if we're looking at Gurley and unsure how they're going to go ahead and get him back in the mix, or how they're going to approach with him coming off being out last week with an injury. So Cooper Kupp, 7,400, I can go ahead and definitely warrant that. T.Y. Hilton is the next guy, significantly different price point for a number one wideout, 5,900 at home against Houston. Now, this game does have an interesting over-under to lead us to believe that Vegas is seeing that there's going to be scoring here. 22.2%, Sal. T.Y. Hilton, 5,900. Help us break this down.
Yeah, so I mean, everybody knows T.Y. Hilton's skill set. He's a little bit more consistent than your similar boomer bust type player. He's coming off a bye, so he should be fully healthy now, a couple weeks removed from in a little injury tweak. But yeah, I think it's a pricing play. That's why the ownership's coming up on him. He should be more expensive. He's too cheap, especially for his upside when it comes to these GPP ownership percentages. So 22%, it's higher than I thought. I thought you would see a guy like Hilton around the 15%, which is just average ownership. So he is coming in as the 3rd highest on DraftKings right now. Maybe a little concerns, but it's not like he's coming in at 30, 35% where Fournette is. So I'm also fine on Hilton's ownership. It's not something that I have a strong stance either way on it. It's clearly a pricing play, in my opinion. It's not any recency bias or the matchup is just so juicy. I think it's a good matchup for him too, but it's just a spot where I don't really have a strong take on it. On Cooper Kupp, I would want over that. On Fournette, I would want over that. Hilton, I think 20% is probably where I would come in anyways. I might actually come in a little bit under, around the average of 15%. So I guess that's my stance.
I think the Colts, they're kind of, their identity is Marlon Mack first, passing game second. And so it's going to be interesting this week to see, do they have that same game plan that they did against the Chiefs, where let's just go ahead and run smash mouth football. Let's control the clock. Let's not give that offense much time to go ahead and be on the field. And I think you got to put Deshaun Watson in the same category as Patrick Mahomes, dual threat, a guy that can hurt you in a lot of ways. And so do they have that same approach this week as far as, okay, we're going to go ahead and run heavy, and then we'll go ahead and get these drop-off passes or whatever the case may be. But the only thing that I will say about Hilton is that he is 3rd in the league as far as catch rate percentage. So what that means is every time that he's throwing the ball, he's at least catching it 89% of the time, which is 3rd highest in the league. So, obviously you can have confidence in knowing that if the ball is going his way, he more than likely will come down with it. But he needs the targets. I mean, he has scored a couple times early on this season. But the way that this offense has been running, and what leads me to believe, is that this is a run-heavy offense first, and that does hurt in a lot of aspects. But the game script narrative could also be Houston does obviously come into Indianapolis and come up big, and where it just has to be a passing game for the Colts. So I think right now what we're seeing is that this is a guy that gets his targets, that has the ability to score, and he's a low price point. So I think that's what we're seeing with ownership and why people are gravitating to T.Y. Hilton. Our last guy for DraftKings, Sal, Mark Andrews, 4,900 tight end going into Seattle. Right on the money with 20% projected ownership here. A little interesting, 4,900, because I like to pivot down a little bit and go to Austin Hooper, who's a little bit less owned and who I feel a little bit more confidence in. But Andrews, going into a tough matchup at Seattle, going to be raining, going to be very cold. How do you feel about him being at 20%?
Yeah, so in terms of the ownership, him being the highest owned tight end, I won't have him as my highest owned tight end. But if Hollywood Brown, who hasn't practiced all week, seems more doubtful than questionable, even though they listed him as questionable, if he's out again, it's just Mark Andrews in terms of down the field actual threats. Mark Andrews is leading the slate for tight ends in air yards per target and his team's air yards market share for tight ends on the entire slate. So this is a guy that if you look at like every play or every reception for Mark Andrews, those types of videos for each week, he's just somehow always wide open. Now, he never plays a ton of the snaps. He'll play on 48% of the snaps, 50% of the snaps, but he's just heavily used in terms of when he's on the field, he'll run routes. So yeah, I think he's fine if Hollywood Brown's out. He's the clear number one option. I prefer, like you said, Austin Hooper. I prefer Darren Waller in the same exact price range. But yeah, Andrews is the guy breaking free. He's at 20%. It seems like all these other tight ends this week at a deep position for the week, they're all hovering around the average ownership mark of 15. So I don't think you're getting too much leverage if you try and pivot just because of ownership from Andrews. But yeah, he wouldn't be my highest owned. He probably comes in from me on this slate as the guy that I get to the third or fourth most at tight end.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned someone who I wanted to chime in on that is cheaper on DraftKings that I feel is probably in a better spot, and that's Darren Waller. If you look at it, he's $200 cheaper, but going into Green Bay, people might say, oh, this is not a good matchup. But you have to hear me out here. I mean, Green Bay, still heavily favored, even with all these injuries. And so you would have to believe that Oakland might be playing from behind a majority of this time. But Darren Waller, to me, he's a dual threat guy. I feel like he's a wideout / tight end. And he's a guy that just gets poured on with targets up until last game against Chicago. I mean, he only got 5 targets, but still had 4 catches for 39 yards. But I mean, this guy is definitely a red zone beast. If he gets the ball thrown to him that way, he's big, he's lanky. I think he could cause problems here over the middle of the field for the Packers. But if they're playing from behind and they're going to have to rely on the passing game, you would think that he's going to have to get his targets. So if you're looking for a strong pivot and someone who is a little bit cheaper, that maybe might present a little bit more upside, in my opinion, I would agree that Darren Waller might be that guy to go ahead and shy away from Andrews, especially being at 20%. I just feel like you can go somewhere else in Waller. You can even go to somewhere else in Ingram, who's got a way better matchup that we'll get into when we talk about that game.
Yeah, I agree. And Darren Waller, like people, if they want to be the game log watcher type people, which I would urge you not to, lots of things go on that change game flows. A week against Chicago, they're leading the whole game. He only sees 5 targets. He sees 5 receptions in the first quarter against Indy a week before that game. So 3 weeks ago because of their bye. And then they get up big. So they just run the ball the whole time until the fourth quarter when he sees 2 more receptions. So if they are going to be trailing on the road in Green Bay, coming in as 4.5, some spots 5-point underdogs against Aaron Rodgers, yeah, I expect a pass heavy script, maybe not pass heavy, but a neutral script where he'll see at least his normal share of targets. And it's a matchup where there's no Darnell Savage, probably the best rookie secondary player in the league. And that's a guy, he's a safety. That's going to be a bump up for Darren Waller. Yeah, I like Darren Waller at this price point. He's right there with Hooper as guys that I'll have probably the most shares of a tight end.
Our last guy that we'll cover, because he is right there, right on the brink at 19.9%, is a guy who's coming back from a high ankle sprain, been out the last couple of weeks. Big time running back, Saquon Barkley, 8,900. Matchup at home against Arizona. Really good matchup for him. Coming back now, I mean, do we have any fear? Should we have the utmost confidence, Barkley, with this injury that he sustained not too long ago? How do you feel about him with the 19.9% projected ownership on DraftKings?
Yeah, man, I didn't think it was going to be this high just because of the pricing on him and a lot of people going to Fournette. I didn't think people wanted to spend that much money on running back, which just lets you know that nobody's going to be owning, at least for the most part, the upper tier wide receivers with any heavy volume, at least not 2 in their lineups. So that's a way to get contrarian. I actually like Saquon. The ownership's not a concern for me when a guy's that talented. It's just a matter of can you maneuver your lineup where you do feel comfortable if you want to play Saquon and Fournette, who are both, yes, chalk right now, right around 20% plus. Fournette coming in close to 40. They're both chalk, but you can get different even by playing both of them. They're in great spots. Yeah, Saquon at 19%, 20%. I really didn't think it would come up that quickly, but the fact that all week long they said he was going to play probably just silenced any doubts on his status. So 8,900, yeah, it's a little bit restrictive, but you can make it work, especially when guys like Alan Lazard potentially open up, and just it makes it a lot easier to get to Saquon in your lineups and feel comfortable about what you're making. So yeah, I'm fine with 20%.
Saquon, number 5, projected highest owned on DraftKings. We go into FanDuel. He's second highest owned, 8,600 on FanDuel, 31.2%. And so I guess to your case, you would have thought, I guess at least I thought, in my opinion, based on his price point still being high and coming back from an injury and being out for so long, that maybe people would kind of come in slowly on him and not as aggressive. But clearly for both sides, I guess that's not the case, Sal.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. And it's even more surprising when you have guys like Dalvin Cook, even on FanDuel, cheaper, and it's shot up this quickly. It's very surprising to me. And I do agree with the ownership, especially since there's a smaller gap in price on FanDuel, that I would rather have Saquon over Dalvin Cook this week. I think there's just more versatility in what the skill set brings you. And it's, instead of $900 difference like on DraftKings, it's only a $300 difference on FanDuel.
Speaking of Dalvin Cook, he's actually the next guy up, 30.5 projected ownership, Sal. 8,300, like you mentioned, cheaper than Barkley. Going into Detroit, we just saw this Detroit defense kind of get shredded by Jamal Williams. I guess that's a fair assessment, which he did. Let's talk about this because Dalvin Cook was a little shut down last week. We talked about that Philadelphia rushing defense, and I mean, they pretty much uphold and contained him. I mean, he did get a score, but let's not discredit throughout the game. I mean, they pretty much had him in the backfield. But I feel like this is a different spot for him. Do you kind of feel the same?
Yeah, I think it's a different spot for him for sure. It's a much better spot. And Mike Daniels right now for the Lions, I want to check what his status is going to be for this game. He's just acquired from Green Bay. He's obviously a run stop guy in the middle of that field on the defensive front. So he missed on Monday night. It didn't seem like he was trending towards playing, but I didn't check on his status as of Friday practice reports. But if Mike Daniels is going to be out, I think he's officially listed questionable. If he's going to be out, that's even better for Dalvin Cook in this matchup. If Daniels is in, it's actually like a sneaky bad, like bottom 5 on the slate type of offensive line versus their defensive line matchup with the Vikings dealing with 2 offensive line injuries. So Daniels is going to be a guy that I'll be watching. Even then, though, I do prefer Saquon over Cook on both sites. And like mentioned on FanDuel, the price point, it's a little easier to get the Saquon there between the two of them. So, yeah, nothing to take away from Dalvin Cook. We all know he's still like PFF's top 2 back listed overall. Elusiveness is there, breaking tackles, everything. But I like the versatility of Saquon a little bit more.
It seems to be a running back by committee here for FanDuel because the next highest projected owned guy at 29.4% Sal is David Johnson. We talked about him a little bit. It seems like people are on the same page as far as DraftKings and FanDuel with David Johnson. But let's talk about this real quick because he's not as highly owned and he's 7,800 on DraftKings. He's still 15%. He's still in the top 15 projected owned, but he's shot up at 7,400 at 29.4% on FanDuel. So, we talked about him a little bit as far as the injury is concerned, but at 7,400 on FanDuel, being much cheaper than Barkley and Dalvin Cook, giving you an extra 1,000, 1,200 between the two. Is this someone that we can pivot to, or is this someone that we can go ahead and roll with as far as the field at 29.4%?
Yeah, I think that field. So if David Johnson suits up, I assume he's healthy. I assume there's no limitations like we were saying earlier. And yeah, on FanDuel, I agree where the ownership's coming in on him as well. The reason why it's higher is, yeah, you still get that price discount. But Chris Carson on DraftKings is cheaper than David Johnson by like $1,300. On FanDuel, Chris Carson's more expensive. So there is major differences in these sites' pricings this week. And I think that's a big reason why you're seeing David Johnson shoot up a little bit. There's not the same type of I guess you can say security in the 6K range if people are pivoting to Carson and sucking up some of that David Johnson ownership on DraftKings. That's not there on FanDuel, so it makes sense that the ownership's coming up. The ownership being that close to some of those other guys, yeah, it's a pricing play at that point. You have to have $1,200 more to get to Barkley, and that's a little bit tougher to do on FanDuel this week, in my opinion. So yeah, I think David Johnson's ownership's fine if he does play. And then, like we said earlier, if he doesn't play, it just becomes Chase Edmonds week, and you probably shouldn't overthink that one.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously we'll find out here shortly whether or not this David Johnson plays. And then I think if David Johnson doesn't play, Sal, do you see such an increase in stock and ownership in Chase Edmonds right away?
Yeah, I think you do. But I think the benefit for us is hopefully, like Schefter has been reporting a lot of things overnight. He'll come out with like 5 or 6 reports overnight. It seems like David Johnson would be one that he would be pushing for a little bit more. But if David Johnson news doesn't come out till like 11:30, there's going to be a far amount of the field that on a Sunday they just don't have time to change it, or they'll forget to change it, or they're not paying close enough attention that Chase Edmonds' ownership, it will definitely rise because there's a community of people who enter 150 lineups. So it's definitely going to rise, but it won't rise nearly as much as it would or ever should when it's that short notice. So if you're somebody who is playing and is going to be paying attention at 11:30 noon tomorrow, you should hope for the latest news on David Johnson if indeed you're trying to pivot to Chase Edmonds. So keep an eye on it. I would say that I'm going to be pivoting in a lot of spots, if not almost all of my spots, to Chase Edmonds if David Johnson is ruled out.
I think what's great too about David Johnson is that this game is not in Arizona, so we don't have to worry about injury report. We will know before main slate actually locks, which is, I think, a huge benefit for all of us. Highest owned wideout, Sal, is next, rounding out the top 5, 27.5% projected ownership, and it's Tyler Lockett at home against the Ravens. Interesting spot. I'm kind of interested here to see why he's rated so high at 27.5%. I know that they struggle with the slot corner position as far as Baltimore is concerned, but this game, the way that the narrative is playing right now with the weather, I don't know necessarily if we'll see a lot of the passing game. I really like Chris Carson in this situation. So help us break this down. Is Tyler Lockett worth it at 27.5% ownership or his price point on FanDuel?
Yeah, so I don't think he is. I'm very much, not even because of the weather. Like, even if the weather holds up, or I guess if it doesn't, I don't really like Tyler Lockett this week. I don't like any of the Seattle passing game. I would agree that Carson would be my favorite part of Seattle, just not tied to that passing game as much. But you're going to have Tyler Lockett, yes, probably being shadowed by Marlon Humphrey. The last 2 weeks, Marlon Humphrey has moved into the slot on Juju. Last week, he absolutely shut down Tyler Boyd. He moved into the slot on 18 of Tyler Boyd's 23 slot routes. So you don't usually see a dominant cornerback do that, but he's shadowed 4 straight weeks now. I imagine it happens. They just got Marcus Peters. He'll be on the outside. Jimmy Smith has been practicing. He might be on the outside. So this Baltimore secondary is actually revamped and something that we haven't seen. Their concerns have been the slot, so that's why people are on Tyler Lockett, but they've been fixing that the last week and a half to 2 weeks, playing Juju and playing Tyler Boyd. And Humphreys has kind of silenced those guys when he's been on them. He has silenced them. So Tyler Lockett, yeah, I don't really want much of Tyler Lockett at all this week, especially on FanDuel where some of the pricing, he's at 6,500. You have guys below him. You have Tyler Boyd a decent amount below him that I think I would like more. Fitzgerald, those types of guys. And even DJ Shark right there at the same price point of 6,600. I much prefer Shark to a Tyler Lockett on both sides. So yeah, Lockett for me is not a guy that I'm prioritizing. I just think the matchup's brutal. And I think people don't realize that Humphrey's probably going to be shadowing him.
Yeah, it's interesting. If Marlon Humphreys is shadowing him, it's not the greatest of matchups. But if he does get someone, let's say, who I think it's not Brandon Carr, but I think it is Justin Bethel or Anthony Everett, I think it fares him better. But I mean, at the end of the day, too, you have to look at it like this. He runs a majority of his routes from the slot. I think he's ran 295 routes from the slot this season so far. But the thing that concerns me with Lockett is the fact that his targets are so sporadic. So what we saw earlier in the year, I mean, he had, I think it was 28 targets in 3 games. But in 2 of those games, he had 26 targets. But since then, he's only had 13 targets across 3 games. So we've seen a significant decline. And I want to ask you, is it because they've kind of changed the way that they have ran the offense where they're running a lot more now, Sal, especially these last 3 weeks? We've seen Chris Carson go over 20 attempts in every single game. Have they created a different identity for this team and only now are relying on Russell Wilson in certain passing situations instead of being a passing first offense?
Yeah, I think even that this is the team that they just have always really wanted to be. It's just that now fully Doug Baldwin's not going to be there and other guys are shipped out. So Lockett, the expectations have been high. And I think he's a great receiver. But yeah, last year, Chris Carson was top 5 in rushing attempts per game. The reason that they were so good in the passing game was just the leading in the league, and over 8% of the times you had a touchdown pass thrown by Russell Wilson. So he didn't throw a lot. There wasn't high volume. So yeah, there's always a concern for Tyler Lockett's target share if they're not playing from behind, as I don't expect this game to go lopsided either way, really. So I expect it to be mainly neutral going into it. So it's not so much that I think they've revamped the offense. I just think like Carson has been the guy they wanted to go to. There was just a couple weeks early on where they played from behind for a large majority of the game, and it really shot up the overall target share. I think it was like an 11 catch day for Tyler Lockett, and you're not going to see that often. I think that more times than not at this price point, Tyler Lockett disappoints, especially in this matchup.
I think you mentioned a few good wideouts that you can pivot from that cost significantly less, that maybe will allow you some room to pay up at running back, or even a defense, as the Bills and 49ers defense seems to be pretty much highly owned in great matchups. But just to give you an idea of some wideouts, Calvin Ridley in a great spot at 5,500. You mentioned another guy, Tyler Boyd at 5,600, who's another great spot as well. I think John Brown at 5,900 is interesting. So, I mean, you have these guys that are in the same as far as opportunity, as far as targets and opportunities to score, that you could pivot from Lockett. So, I'm not too confident with what we've seen as far as the target share for him over the last few weeks. And I think I might want to see something change. But going against the Ravens defense, where I could see them really hammering the ball on the ground, really just wants me to believe that maybe fading Tyler Lockett might be the guy to fade out of all these guys that we just spoke about.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that game in general is a game that I don't really want much of overall. The Vegas total coming up high on it, and we'll see what the weather does. But I think that's probably the most inaccurate spot in terms of Vegas over unders. Like I think the game goes under for the reasons you said. Both teams want to run the ball, and this Ravens secondary that's been sort of picked apart is now completely revamped. Like two new guys are going to be there with Marcus Peters and Jimmy Smith that haven't been there for the past month.
Yes, and here's the thing: is we're going to go into Week 7 main slate now, guys, and break down each game. We'll go into the early games first, and go into the later games next. But before we do, we just wanted to remind you guys: we spoke about some tools, we spoke about ownership, and we have the Top Stack tool and Fantasy Cruncher and all these different articles that are behind the paywall. You guys, if you're not subscribed yet to Awesemo.com, use the code NFL Strategy, get 50% off your first month. Try it out. Let us know what you think. But you have access and resources and tools from the number one player in the world himself, Alex Baker, Awesemo. So guys, NFL Strategy is the code, and we thank you guys once again for supporting, and hit that thumbs up like always. All right, Rams at Falcons. We'll go over this first game, Sal. Rams 3-point favorites, 54.5 over under. A lot of weapons in this game, Sal. I'm curious to see what kind of direction are you leaning in as far as the offenses.
Yeah, so starting on the Rams side of the ball, yeah, a lot of weapons in it. It's going to garner a lot of ownership. So, like when I get to this game, I'm probably going to do more 5-man stacks than I usually do, just to become even more unique, because I know there's going to be a lot of ownership everywhere. So, on the Rams side of it, not going to have too much. Probably not going to have any really Todd Gurley. It's really the receiving game and the passing game. So, Cook's price point, all the price points are favorable. In GPPs, I would probably rank it Cup, Cooks, and then Woods for me. And then in cash, it would be Cup, Woods, and then Cooks. So I like all the wide receivers. I'm going to have 5-man stacks. I'm going to have pieces of Goff, who is the second highest home quarterback right now with some of his pass catchers. And then I'll run it back with two players from the other side of this. So, yeah, for me, it's Jared Goff coming off the worst game of his career and the worst game under Sean McVay. I think when that happens, you have even more incentive to just try and get everything right on offense. He's a guy who his narrative is he folds under pressure. He had a ton of pressure, top 3 in the league, San Fran last year. He will not have anywhere near that this week against the Atlanta Falcons. So I do think in the Dome, although it's on the road for Goff, but in the Dome, it should be beneficial, a big bounce back spot. And yeah, I like all the wide receivers in that order. On the Atlanta side of it, yeah, Jalen Ramsey being there is huge. I think that at $8,000, the ownership coming in on Julio, even before Jalen Ramsey got there, was a little bit much, just because of the way it restricts you being able to get to Fournette and then another top-end running back, which I usually prefer to do. So I'm really not going to get too much Julio. My preference in terms of stacks, if I'm going to Matt Ryan or running it back, is just Calvin Ridley because of the price point in his matchup, with no Talib on that side, going to be going up against a journeyman backup cornerback in Hill. And then it's Austin Hooper in the middle of the field. So that's my main priorities on that side of the ball. Just getting to Atlanta, the rest of the team. Yeah, Mohamed Sanu in the slot. He actually has a difficult matchup against Robbie Coleman, or not as great as guys like Ridley and Hooper have. But what's interesting is Sanu has 60 pounds on Robbie Coleman. Like, Sanu's not your typical slot receiver in terms of being small and shifty. So there is a mismatch in that sense. But I think Robbie Coleman's still a good enough coverage cornerback that I don't think you see a Sanu ceiling game that rarely ever comes out, once every year and a half or so. But that's where I'm mainly out in the passing game. Devonta Freeman on the ground, he gets his most upside in the receiving game. And that's not a spot that I'm going to be testing this week, especially after he's coming off of a 2-touchdown game in the air last week.
Matt Ryan, I feel like is definitely in play for cash game. I spoke about him yesterday on the show with Manny Laura. He's hit 300 yards in every game. So I think that's very important, especially on Draftkings purposes, where you get the 300-yard bonus. But I want to talk about the LA Rams here. I mean, we just saw a team really get dismantled by the 49ers defense. The pressure was so much high on Jared Goff, where he was very inaccurate, got sacked a ton. and just looked very uncomfortable. And I think for him, when you have defenses like that, it really puts pressure on the quarterback to try to make plays, and he just wasn't able to. I mean, he succumbed to that pressure all day long in that matchup. Going into this game, though, it's a little different story. Atlanta Falcons, they rank, I think it's 20th in adjusted pressure rate and 31st in adjusted pass defense. And why this is important is because, being able to move the ball is obviously efficient and key for us here in daily fantasy sports. And he has so many weapons. And I think if they're able, this offensive line, to really keep away that pressure, even though it's fairly weak for that front four of the Falcons, I think Goff, this is a bounce back game. He'll have more time in the pocket. I think he'll be able to have his receivers run their routes, and I think he'll be able to pick apart this Atlanta secondary. So I think Goff and Ryan are both in play. We talked about Todd Gurley, how he has a lot of upside if he's utilized in the way that we saw against the Seattle Seahawks. Ownership is not there on him, so he could be one of those sneaky plays, and he does have a good matchup. So with Malcolm Brown out, I think the real question is, do they really want to get Darrell Henderson involved a lot, or is this a must-win situation for the Rams where they need their best players on the field the entire time, and they need to be able to put themselves in a position to win this game? And I think Cooper Kupp, we talked about it, highly owned, but it definitely warrants. I mean, he leads the NFL in targets per game at 11.5 targets. He's going to draw a very nice matchup in the slot. I think they rank bottom 5, Sal, against the slot wide receivers. So, for me, there's a lot of weapons in this game. You can't go wrong. And I'm in agreement with you. I think there's a lot of ways you can go in this game. So it makes it very interesting being the game with the highest over-under on the slate.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you just target primarily from both sides, just the passing game is where you should be keying in on. And if you are worried about it, that it's probably going to be the chalkiest stack, I think it makes sense and it's warranted to even go to 5-man stacks this week.
Our next game, Sal, Jaguars at Bengals. We talked about the heavy volume, Kane and Leonard Fournette. Jacksonville 4.5-point favorites, 44 over/under. How do you feel about this line, 4.5? It's, I would think that it might have been a little bit more. I don't know. I just don't think the Bengals are that good. And so I'm curious to see, outside of Leonard Fournette, is there anywhere else we can attack in this matchup? And is Jacksonville defense on the radar at all?
Yeah, so the line, I think the fact that they're just going to be on the road in Cincy is where you're getting more of like the bump from the line. But we already talked about Fournette, went into decent detail. If you're just tuning in, you could see the replay in the beginning. But outside of Fournette, yeah, I actually like DJ Chark a lot. So what you're getting from Cincy this week is a bottom 4 pass secondary, like already bottom 5 in the league in their secondary in terms of coverage. And now they're going to be out without William Jackson III, who's played the most snaps for them at cornerback. And then they're going to be out. They're also going to be without this week Dre Kirkpatrick, who's played the second most snaps from the cornerback. So their top 2 cornerbacks are out for a team that is bottom 5 in the league already. And now you have DJ Chark coming to town. You have, for this game, Dede Westbrook's in the slot is questionable. He'll face BW Webb, which is probably the toughest matchup, honestly, out of all of them, just because you have second and third string cornerbacks on the outside. So, yeah, it's tough because I love Fournette a ton, and I don't want to correlate Fournette with Minshew, but I also have a lot of interest in that same price range as T.Y. Hilton this week at wide receiver and DJ Chark in his matchup. Yeah, it's a spot where I'm probably going to have, where I don't have Fournette, I'll have DJ Chark lineups, and maybe I'll mix them in a little bit together. But I really like DJ Chark as well. It's just his skill set and how much he's flourished in just the first 5 games of the season, 5-6 games. And now he's going to get to go up against pretty much a third string cornerback as if it's the preseason there. So, yeah, I like that spot for DJ Chark. And for me, Minshew is just not a spot I get to because, yeah, I like Chark, but I like Fournette a ton. So I'm not going to have enough time or enough options to want to stack him with. And I don't personally think that I would want to stack Fournette with Minshew, mainly because, and we talked about it on Thursday with Lofty, Minshew and Fournette's correlation is like 1 fantasy point for Minshew. Like more times than not, it'll be 4 catches or so for 20 yards for Fournette, which is good for Fournette's overall ceiling and floor. But for Minshew, it doesn't do anything in terms of positively correlating that much. So that's where I mainly go. And I do think Jacksonville's defense is in play, especially if you are playing a ton of Leonard Fournette. There's a small correlation there between him and the defense.
Yeah, I agree. I want to ask you, we were very high on Dede Westbrook last week, which I'll run that back again and would play that same situation, over and over again, because I feel like it was the right play. And the price point and the situation justified that. You spoke on DJ Chark. Can we look at Dede Westbrook this week, even though I know that, with the injury and really being unsure if he's going to play or not, is he someone that's in play? And then I also would love for you to go in and talk about Auden Tate for a second.
Yeah, definitely. So Dede Westbrook, dealing with this injury, if he plays, like I said earlier, he'll be facing BW Webb in the slot. Webb in his career has not been a good cornerback, but this year he's been pretty solid. Only targeted 14 times on 126 coverage snaps, only giving up 9 catches for 110 yards. So Westbrook at his price point, I think he leans more towards a cash play this week if he is healthy, just because of the price point. And yeah, he's been targeted a ton, 8+ times the last 3 weeks for Dede. Last week, yeah, it doesn't work out, but that whole offense was just in stagnant mode last week. Dede, I think, led the team in receiving with 53 receiving yards. So that just tells you enough about how Gardner Minshew and the Jags were playing last week, and a difficult matchup overall for their offensive line. So I think Dede is in play, but I'm not going to get there only because I'm not prioritizing Jags stacks. And then at that low 4K range at wide receiver, I'm not really around there too much. I find myself in the 5K range around Calvin Ridley and such. So that's my stance on Dede. I think he's fine. Probably lean more so for cash. On Auden Tate, yeah, I actually think when you factor in price that I like Auden Tate more than Tyler Boyd this week. Auden Tate, he has a fantastic matchup versus Trey Herndon, or should for the majority of that game on the outside. Herndon's given up 232 yards and 2 touchdowns this year. Auden Tate is the red zone target. Like, he's taking away whatever role Tyler Eifert still had on this team. 8 red zone targets, which is the highest on the slate, tied with a couple of guys, Michael Thomas being one of them, pretty much in just 4 games. He was the wide receiver 3 for the far majority of the games this season, not even playing the first 2 weeks. So yeah, Auden Tate is an actual weapon for this team. Last week, he was a jump ball guy, just catching everything. So I do actually have interest in Auden Tate. He's currently in a GPP player pool of mine, and I would expect to see more than him pop up than Boyd, but that's not due to skill set. That's just due to the price there.
Yeah, you just hit on what I was going to speak on, is the fact that Auden Tate, when you look at his last 4 games, 4 D targets and 7 red zone targets. But I think the biggest thing is he's seen almost a quarter of the entire targets that Dalton has thrown. And I think the biggest confidence booster in wanting to roster Tate is the fact that in these 4 straight games, he's played almost 90% of the snaps. So he's there. And I feel like what we've seen over the last few weeks is a chemistry that's been building between him and Dalton. Nothing against Boyd, because Boyd has been such a target share beast, but what we've seen is the consistency kind of leaning more towards Tate than Boyd. But I think both of these guys are still in play, especially if what we're seeing or what we're thinking with Jacksonville kind of dominating this game and Cincinnati playing from behind, I think he's going to have to lean on those 2 wideouts. So almost similar price points, but I think either way, I think you could switch it up and mix with both of them. I think both of them are good plays.
Yeah, I agree.
Next game, Sal, a little bit different narrative here. 41 over under, Buffalo 17-point favorites. Dolphins at Buffalo, Sal. I want to talk about this game. Yesterday, I spoke about John Brown being probably with this Zay Jones trade. I think John Brown, if he does play and suit up, I think it could be a sneaky play. I mean, this is the worst pass defense in the league. John Brown gained a little bit of love and ownership, but would love to hear you and your take on this game. And also Bills defense, Sal, just to give you an idea, pretty highly owned for FanDuel. I didn't see DraftKings. I'll have to look back and check it. But I would love for you to break down the Bills defense too in this matchup, where I strongly believe that I don't think they're going to give up a point.
Yeah. So you get the Bills coming off a bye at home. And at this point, especially getting colder now in Buffalo, that's probably like a top 2 or 3 home field advantage. I think of New England. I think of New Orleans in the entire league. Like, Buffalo is a scary place to have to go into on the road, especially as this big of an underdog. So yeah, Josh Allen, usually you don't want to play quarterbacks who can't get into a shootout. That's not something that, if you look at trends of the past DFS slates being won. But this year, Miami's sort of breaking that rule. Smaller sample, sure, but quarterbacks going for 25 plus on average. So yeah, Josh Allen's in a fine spot if you want to pay for him. I prioritize those guys in the Atlanta and Rams game, but he's going to come in at lower ownership. He has rushing upside, running the second most times per game at 8 times per game, only behind Lamar Jackson, actually running more than Kyler Murray this year. So yeah, Josh Allen's fine if you want to get there. I probably don't get there as much. And John Brown's the only pass catcher that I want to pair him with. You touched on it. If John Brown's actually going to be playing in this game, which it seems as of the end of the week that there was more positive news coming out about his status. And on the opposite side of that, Xavier Howard, who's having a down year, but still the best cornerback for the Dolphins. All of his sentiment is coming out that he's listed as questionable, but it's seeming like he's more doubtful to play. So yeah, it's a good matchup for Brown, a huge spread. So it's not usually the spot you want to correlate wide receivers and quarterbacks, but we've seen it working all year so far this year. It is the trend of it is the first half is just when your wide receivers and quarterbacks will do very well. In the second half, the running game takes over. So it's Josh Allen, it's John Brown to lesser extents for me in this game. I know that Duke Williams ran the second most routes at wide receiver. They finally unleashed him and got rid of Zay Jones, but he's not a guy that I'm going to be prioritizing in week 7.
Yeah, I mean, Josh Allen, I spoke about it yesterday. I think definitely could be cash game consideration, dual threat guy, gets you with both ways, feet or through the air, if he's efficient and if he's accurate. But John Brown, I mean, I think there's going to be some high leverage looks here. And once again, 32nd in deep ball adjusted yards per attempt allowed from the Miami Dolphins. Cole Beasley's not necessarily your deep guy. He's the guy in the slot that usually does these little check downs or these little slants. But I mean, he could also be somewhat interesting if you're looking for someone in a GBP and just trying to switch up and differentiate yourself. These two guys, fairly priced, pretty cheap. The only two guys I think that are going to, basically get the targets. So, yeah, I mean, outside of that, though, Bills defense playing against a very, very weak Miami team could be very strong in play. I like them too. But outside of that, I mean, I don't think I'm going anywhere on the Dolphins side. How about you?
Yeah, no interest on the Dolphins side. I mean, if Jakeem Grant misses this one, he's been practicing limited all week. I don't know what the status is officially on him. Albert Wilson becomes like slightly interesting out of the slot in a very pass-heavy approach. I don't want anything on the outsides because Buffalo plays very strong zone defense. They're going to limit Devontae Parker and Preston Williams and any of the upside they have. So Albert Wilson becomes sort of a sneaky GPP type play in the slot if Jakeem Grant misses. But yeah, that's like a milli maker play, and there's nothing stable in this Miami offense.
Yeah, I mean, once again, not heavy shares, but I mean, if you're doing 150 lineups and you want to do a couple Bills, I think, that's okay. But outside of that, I mean, really nothing more. Next game, Sal, Vikings at Lions. Vikings 2-point favorites, 43.5 over under. We spoke a lot about Dalvin Cook and probably a better matchup this week against the Lions front four that we just saw Monday Night Football. Really couldn't handle the rushing offense of the Green Bay Packers. But outside of Dalvin Cook, we've seen kind of Kirk Cousins revitalize this passing game over the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, we saw Thielen go off. Last week, we saw Diggs go off. Is this passing game now going to go ahead, moving forward, be more involved? And can we look towards these two premium wideouts to go ahead and roster this week?
Yeah, so I think moving forward, it'll still lean run heavy. Like last week, the Diggs touchdowns, two of them, he was just wide open. Like that Eagles secondary is really, really abysmal. So I think that was more situational. I don't think they want to have Kirk Cousins throwing 40 times a year like last year. But I do think they'll throw more than they were planning to, just because of the outbursts from both their wide receivers coming out to the media. More so Diggs was getting the attention, but even Thielen was saying we have to throw more. So I think it's just going to go back to being primarily Dalvin Cook's team. This matchup. And yeah, I grabbed the updated injury report from Friday. Mike Daniels is listed as out, so that's a bump for Dalvin Cook for sure. A couple of guys in the Detroit defense are going to be out for this game to go along with that in the linebacker unit. So yeah, the front seven's banged up for Detroit, so it makes it a little bit better of a matchup for Cook, but he's going to be missing an offensive lineman. He's going to have one of the guards on the line who missed last week, Josh Klein, back, but playing limited, dealing with an injury all week, limited participants. So it's a good spot for Dalvin Cook because of these injuries, and I think he's the guy who gets the most work here. It's just relative to the slate. Yes, I want Fournette. I want David Johnson if he plays, and I want to find the money to get to Saquon. So that's just my preference at running back this week. I think it's fine. In terms of the passing game, yeah, both these wide receivers have really good matchups. Like Darius Slay, sure, he's been good in the past last year, dealing with injuries this year, but he's not been good so far this year. And Adam Thielen would be the guy who probably sees him the most based on where they line up. But the upside for Adam Thielen is they move him around into the slot enough to avoid that matchup a good amount of the time if you are scared of the matchup. And then Stephon Diggs is likely to face Rashawn Melvin, who's been below average at best so far this year. Diggs is averaging 16.1 air yards per target, primarily coming from last week's game. So, yeah, I think both wide receivers are in a good spot. If I had to pick one, it's still Thielen just based on the target share. But if I get anything from this game, and I'm really not getting much Minnesota at all, it's Dalvin Cook.
Yeah, I mean, Stephon Diggs, regardless of his low targets per game, I think he's outside of like the top 50 among eligible wideouts at this point. He does lead the NFL in air yard share and is 18th in air yards per game. So, I mean, big plays is what gets you and what helps you out in fantasy. And to tell you the truth, I'd rather have one or two big plays in the game than, 5 or 6 small targets and no scores. Adam Thielen, I mean, for him, he ranks top 10 amongst deep targets. And I mean, if you look at the slot, I feel like Detroit is a little bit more vulnerable in that area. But I mean, regardless, Thielen, a lot of talent there. And I mean, if they're going to attack the slot, that's probably the better situation rather than on the outside. Because, I mean, you have Darius Slay. And, still Darius Slay, according to PFF, still has some games, still has some highly rated attributes about him in the secondary position. Detroit offense, Kerryon Johnson was talked about a lot this week. And I want to ask you, his ownership doesn't justify that right now. He's come down a little bit in ownership, but is Kerryon Johnson a play here? I mean, are you getting anywhere with Kerryon Johnson?
So based on the range, I prefer Josh Jacobs a good amount more. So that's why I'm not getting into as much Kerryon. But Kerryon would probably be second in that 5K range for me if indeed Edmonds doesn't open up. If Edmonds opens up, it's Edmonds, then Jacobs, then Kerryon for me. But this is actually a good in terms of his offensive line versus Minnesota's defensive line. according to PFF, this is a top 3 beneficial matchup. It's the second best actually on the slate in terms of his offensive line is going to have an advantage in the running game, not in the passing game, but in the running game. So if you take that with a grain of salt, yeah, it's a good spot for him. He's played 70+% of the snaps each of the last 3 weeks. The concern is, how does this game go out? He's been very ineffective when he's touching the ball on the ground, which isn't good. But volume over efficiency is definitely a thing. It's just a spot where he comes in the 5K range as like the guy that I want the third most of. So when you factor in the other running backs, I'm probably not going to have much of him. And that's probably where that one stands overall for me. It's not like a fantastic spot, especially because we haven't seen this passing game role like they said in the beginning of the year that we would see.
I want to talk about the wideouts real quick. I know you talked about Galladay a little bit. Galladay has had at least 8 targets in every game this season and at least 109 air yards in 4 of 5 games. And so he has 16 deep targets in the last I think 4 or 5 games, which ranks him 5th among all receivers. And then on Marvin Jones' side for the passing game, he's had, I think, a 5-game series, Sal, of 91, 130, 89, and 85 air yards. And I mean, that's a lot of opportunity. Has he benefited from a lot of that? Not necessarily. But that amount of air yards per game, which is 98.8 air yards, at least allows you to know that they're trying to go deep to Marvin Jones essentially a lot of the time.
Yeah. So they are. And last week they had a tough matchup on Marvin Jones against Jair Alexander. The week that he went off, it was just schemed that way because Kenny Golladay was getting double teamed. So Marvin Jones is actually having a good year. Some tough matchups that he's won. He'll get probably Xavier Rhodes this week just based on the way that Minnesota has been playing this year. Xavier Rhodes has been going on number 2 wide receivers. They've been putting Trey Waynes on your number 1, which I would assume is Kenny Golladay to the Vikings. So yeah, Marvin Jones, I'm probably not going to get too much of, but Kenny Golladay, I like a good amount this week. Especially if he is going to be going up against Trey Waynes, a guy who's given up 27 receptions so far in 6 weeks, 259 yards and 6 touchdowns, a 68% completion percentage against. And I think Kenny Golladay is in that Cortland Sutton territory of maybe in DFS, people are starting to talk about them, but just in general, not talking about the quality years that they're having.
Trey Waynes and Xavier Rhodes, Sal, over 500 yards receiving allowed between both of them and 3 scores. So, you have to say, I think the defense for the Vikings, where it's strong, is probably the rushing game. But I think in the secondary, regardless of the talent that they have in these corners, I think there's a little bit of weakness there. And just to look at it, playing devil's advocate, do you think in any way that this has shootout potential based on kind of the weapons that they have on both sides of the ball, and with Stafford being a pass-heavy guy, and then also with the wide receivers from the Vikings?
Yeah, so I think there's upside to happen, right? Like the game script that you think happens here is Dalvin Cook runs a ton and there's less plays overall, so you don't get that shootout potential. But like the upside for it to happen, yeah, I think there is when you have both those guys on the outside for both of these teams, really, when it comes to the wide receivers. I think there is. I think the only downside there is that, and maybe not downside for DFS because it'll be very concentrated at that point because these running backs at least carry on and to a lesser extent carry on over Dalvin Cook, don't catch the ball as much. So there's upside for it, especially when Matt Stafford in this game and Cousins just going back to last year's 40-plus attempts per game type of format, if that's how it unravels. But I think that's the exact recipe that really both of these teams don't want to get into. We even saw it last week with Detroit, focused and went very, very much just run heavy. And even in like the first and second quarter of that game, milking the play clock down to the last second to just have as little plays as possible in it.
I agree. I think, either way, I think you could look at this game from both sides. But the next game is probably a game that, we want to talk about a little bit more. Arizona, the Giants, Sal. We talked about some key guys in this game already. But this game, essentially, 2 weak defenses screams shootout. Should we anticipate that, or should we expect anything different?
Yeah, I mean, the team total for these teams, especially the Giants, is kind of surprising when the week opens. So, yeah, it's seeming like there's a better chance at a shootout here than everything just staying low scoring and not much efficiency because of the 2 bad defenses. And honestly, with the players coming back on potentially both sides of the ball if Kirk comes back, but coming back for the Giants in this one, yeah, it seems like a spot where there's going to be a lot of offense. So just starting on the Arizona side, it seems like Kyler Murray's the guy going a little bit unnoticed and probably wrongfully so because of the fact that there's that Arizona or that Atlanta and Rams game on the slate. So I think Kyler Murray does have upside, especially at lower ownership, you would imagine. Not as important for quarterbacks as the ownership because it depends on who you're pairing them with for these tournaments. But definitely in cash, there's upside, definitely in tournaments if he's going to be that much lower owned. And yeah, Arizona is kind of a question mark right now. We'll wait and see. If David Johnson plays, he's fine. If Christian Kirk plays, he's a very good price or at a very good price point, and he'll probably get Janoris Jenkins have to go into the slot because they'll play so many 4 wide receiver sets. And Jenkins has given up 351 yards and 3 touchdowns this year. So Kirk will be in a good spot. We touched on Fitzgerald against Grant Haley, giving up the most passing yards from the slot this year. He's giving up 285 yards. That's 38 more than any other slot cornerback, 123 passer rating against him. He's played the 7th most slot coverage snaps in the league as well. So all these guys have great matchup. If Kirk is in, there's much more upside in terms of Arizona's stacks with Murray. And then if he's out, I'd probably just take pieces of Murray in cash games, maybe if I end up going there, and then primarily just pieces of Larry Fitzgerald. So yeah, Arizona is the question mark on the entire slate. Seeing what happens with Kirk and seeing what happens with David Johnson will shift a lot of things for me. Earlier, we talked on how to kind of handle that a little bit. On the Giants side, we talked on Saquon a lot. If you have the money and you want to get there, I think it's fine. I prioritize Leonard Fournette for cheaper over him, but I do prioritize Saquon over Dalvin Cook this week. And then from there on out, that's pretty much it. Shepard not going to play. Golden Tate does have a good matchup in the slot this week against Brock, probably the best matchup out of all those guys, with Patrick Peterson coming back on the outside to cover Slayton. But that's pretty much it. I don't have much interest in Daniel Jones, the quarterback here personally.
So someone asked in chat if, I like Fitzgerald this week. And here's the thing is that I've played Fitzgerald the last few weeks because of the Kirk injury, because of the matchups. I thought Cincinnati was a great matchup for him. I thought Atlanta was a great match for him. But what we've seen change, the first 2 games he had 24 targets, Fitzgerald. And then since then, 7, 5, 8, and 8, right? Targets are there. I mean, yeah, we can go ahead and justify that. Red zone targets, though, last 3 games, 1. First 3 games, he had 6. So I'm just trying to figure out what has changed with the offense and Fitzgerald. And once again, I don't mind Fitzgerald as a play here, but I feel like I'm tired of going on the same train and him just only getting 5 catches, 40 yards, 6 catches, 50 yards. Yeah, I mean, PPR, that's great for DraftKings, but on FanDuel, that type of production doesn't help warrant the wide receiver position. Now, is that something that you're in agreement with, or try to help me understand? Because I'm just trying to figure out what has changed over the last 3 weeks compared to the first 3 weeks as far as the looks and the production of Larry Fitzgerald.
Yeah, I think Larry Fitz just suffers from not having Kirk there. I think in the passing game that when there's 4 wide receiver sets and when you have Kirk on the field playing 80% of his snaps out of the slot and Fitzgerald playing 95% or somewhere around there in the 90s out of the slot, it's much harder for a defense to defend 4 wide receiver sets and 2 slot receivers as opposed to when you're running 11 personnel and if Fitzgerald is the key target, it's much easier for them to defend that. So I think honestly, it's just been Kirk being out has been hurting Fitzgerald. I think that's the direct thing that's happening these last couple of weeks. They're focusing on throwing the balls to the running back more. And last week we saw Arizona actually start to take more deep shots, completing 2 deep shots down the field to both Bird and Trent Sherfield. So yeah, I think it's just directly, maybe small sample size for sure in there as well, but I think it's just directly having a lot more attention on him because Christian Kirk isn't in the other side of the field in the slot with his running mate. So just more eyes on Fitzgerald, I think, is the main reason why you're seeing just less targets.
Would you rather have, and I'm going to ask you, Fitzgerald or Tyler Boyd?
This week, I think I would rather have Fitzgerald just because that matchup against Grant Haley, if Kirk is out, and even if Kirk's in, it's probably going to be either Haley or Jenkins. It's just such a better matchup than what Boyd's going to be dealing with.
Okay. I mean, I guess that's fair. I think, what it comes down to is the matchup's great. We've seen him get the targets. Once again, I want to see more red zone targets like we did the first few games. I feel like if that changes, and if Kirk's on the field, I agree with you. I think Kirk helps benefit Fitzgerald, but if he's off, I think maybe we see the beneficiary going to David Johnson.
That's fair. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Next game, 49ers at Redskins. San Fran, 10-point favorites, over under 40. I mean, what's there to say? We've seen this 49ers defense now the last 2 weeks just dismantle the Browns offense and then also the Rams offense. Pretty legit team. I think I'm on board now and a believer. Do the Redskins have any shot here? And are you going anywhere in this game as far as fantasy purposes, maybe outside of the 49ers defense, Sal?
Yeah, so from the Washington side of it, no real interest in any of those plays. I know people are going to want to go up and say, oh, Terry McLaurin's out there and he might still be too cheap based on his production. I don't think so. Whether he plays Richard Sherman or mostly on the outside because Witherspoon's still going to be out, Sherman's only allowing 23 yards per game this season, and mostly on the other end in a limited sample is only allowing 23 yards per game. So it's a brutal spot. Those numbers are going to change. Those will be like historic records, but Terry McLaurin is not in a good spot. Nothing on Washington. On the San Fran side of the ball, you're gonna have no Deebo Samuel. Mostert has not been practicing, so it seems like you might only have 2 running backs. We'll see if they activate Jeff Wilson. They love 3 running back sets, so there's a chance they do that. I do think Kittle's in a good spot, but based on the depth at tight ends this week, he's going to come in low owned, and it's wrong that he is there, but it's really hard to want to prioritize him at the top end when there's so many better options right there next to him in Ingram, and then also in the 4 and 5K range. So I think Kittle's still in a fine spot to see around 7-8 targets, even if you only get 28 pass attempts from Jimmy G. But I understand why people aren't going there, and I'm probably not going there. And then, it's Tevin Coleman versus Matt Breida. Coleman's been taking over the workload. But when you're in that mid 5K range at running back, and I had somebody reach out and just say, like, there's not enough talk around Tevin Coleman. Like, it's a fantastic matchup. But when you're in that mid 5K range, you have other backs down there that are going to see 80+% of their team's carries. Whereas Tevin Coleman, you're lucky if he sees 60% of his team's carries. So I think it's just an upside thing there. He can run the ball 20 times, which would be great. But I think more times than not, it's going to be split somewhere around what you're seeing, these 15, 16 carries per game. And his upside is just a little bit capped. So yeah, you mentioned it, like going to players in this game, I'm really not getting anywhere. I'd probably get to the most Kittle. And even that said, he'll probably be like my 5th owned tight end.
I think one thing to take note is Tevin Coleman, 10 red zone chances over the past 2 games. And he's been pretty much heavily involved. We've seen Matt Breida take a kind of a step back. Breida's only played 36% of the snaps in the last 2 games with Coleman back. And we've seen now an increase in Coleman at 55% of the snaps. So if you want to talk about maybe Breida taking a back seat to the second, running back, Tevin Coleman is probably the guy. And looking at this matchup, Washington fairly weak against the run. We've seen kind of what offenses have done this year against them in the rushing game. Surrendered a lot of yards, a lot of touchdowns, and a lot of fantasy points to the running back position. So I think somewhat interesting Tevin Coleman in this case. And what we've seen the last 2 games, as far as it's a very small sample size, but at least it leads us to believe that maybe Tevin Coleman is the guy. And if he's getting that type of look in the red zone, 10 red zone chances the last 2 games, it's got to give you some kind of confidence to know that if you want to get a little sneaky or go a little contrarian, maybe Tevin Coleman is not as bad of an option.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the matchup is great, and it made me think earlier, like, this is a really good matchup. And yeah, if it does tilt to a spot where a lot of people are thinking, you get overall from this team 35 to 40 rushing attempts, which they've done a couple of times this year, and there is no Mostert, well then, yeah, you could still have Breida touching the ball 15 times, and Coleman can still touch a 20 in that type of a format if they don't activate a Jeff Wilson Jr. So there's definitely upside there. I think I just still prefer a guy like Josh Jacobs, but I don't think that it's out of like the realm of possibility, and it should be rostered if you are playing 150 lineups.
Coleman, 5% on DraftKings, 9% on Fanduel. Kittle, 15% on Fanduel, 7.5% on DraftKings as far as the current Awesemo.com ownership projections. So we go into the later games now. There's 3 of them. First one is pretty an ugly one, and I really want to talk about this for a second. Chargers at Titans, Tennessee 2.5-point favorites, 41 over/under. Sal, I said it yesterday on the show with Manny. I feel like Melvin Gordon has destroyed this offense and has completely transcended it in a negative way since he's been back. And tell me if I'm wrong, but we've seen a significant decline in Keenan Allen's production. Austin Eckler doesn't seem like the same back, nor is he being utilized in the same way. Hunter Henry, yes, he's stepped up at tight end, which will probably be somewhat popular due to what we saw last week against the Steelers. But I don't have as much confidence in the Chargers offense as I did before Melvin Gordon. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I don't either, especially from a fantasy perspective, because you're getting a capped off Austin Eckler you're lucky if you get 10 touches out of him total with Hunter Henry back and Melvin Gordon. I think this is just a brutal spot overall for the entire offense. I do think that Keenan Allen at 6% owned with the price tag coming down is to me sort of a red flag of, is this guy going to be a low price for the year of 6,700? And now's the time to jump back on after a couple of one bad matchup and just then after that brutal spot. So yeah, for the Chargers right now, I think that Melvin Gordon, it's a tough spot to really trust a running back on the ground for the Chargers. They lose Mike Pouncey. Their offensive line has been getting no push at all. One of the worst advantages in terms of offensive lines versus defensive lines this week. It's not a spot that I want to get to. I think Hunter Henry's cheap enough, and he still is not a guy that I'm prioritizing. The matchup's fine. It's just that we've already talked about Waller. We've already talked about Hooper, Andrews, Ingram. All these guys I like more than Hunter Henry. And if it was a week where you had tight salary pricing, sure, but it's not. Like Leonard Fournette's too cheap. You might have Alan Lazard open up. You might have Chase Edmonds open up. I don't have to pay down at tight end this week. I feel like I like the upside up a little bit more. So when it comes to the Chargers, I'm not really getting to much of that side of the ball at all. The only thing that I'm trying to get more of, and not much, but if Keenan Allen's 6%, like me coming in at 10 to 15% Keenan Allen, I feel completely fine and really like that leverage play.
Yeah, I mean, Keenan Allen, my God, I mean, it was hard to not roster him the first few weeks. Now it's like you're trying to push the envelope and force the situation. But it's like you said, I mean, he is going to be low owned. That's one thing. So, and his price has changed a little bit. He's now down to 6,700 on DraftKings, and on FanDuel, he's sitting at 7,500. So not as much as a decline as compared to DraftKings, but nowhere to be found in ownership. So if you want to talk about maybe a sneaky upside play, someone who can perform if he's throwing the rock and if he's getting the looks, Keenan Allen could be somewhat interesting in this matchup. Outside of that, though, how do you feel about the running game here as far as either side of the ball? Derrick Henry came off a bad game against Denver. Someone who I thought maybe might be in a position where they just run, but Mariota is just not that good, Sal. I mean, to be honest with you, it's about time that they pulled him. So any love for the running game, or is there any love for the defenses as we round out this game?
Yeah, so Derrick Henry on that side of the ball, I think he's in a good spot, like the spot that you want to target him as a home favorite. We'll see what happens with the Chase Edmonds of the world. Again, I'd rather save money and go to Josh Jacobs, who we still have yet to get to. But I think that Derrick Henry's in a fine spot. I even prefer Marlon Mack slightly ahead of him. So it's just tough for me to want to get there. Although this is the week that you see a 23-touch, 100-yard double score game. The only concern is they put Ryan Tannehill in, which might actually be an upgrade from Marcus Mariota. But how much do we actually trust that Tannehill can lead some red zone drives? So I'm just not high on this team. The one spot that I do like is sort of like a 1% Millie Maker play. Looking into it a little bit more is actually A.J. Brown. The matchup for Brown, he won't have to face Casey Hayward. That'll be Corey Davis. The concern is obviously Ryan Tannehill, but A.J. Brown is the last 2 weeks has taken over the number 2 wide receiver role for this Titans team in terms of snaps. And we know a big physical receiver with upside and speed. So I think A.J. Brown's a Millie Maker type play. But once I saw the switch from Mariota to Tannehill, I think it is an upgrade in the short term, maybe. But overall for these receivers, it doesn't really make me want to get there all that much. This game in general is not something that I'm getting to outside of sort of a leverage play in Keenan Allen. And I think Hunter Henry is fine, but probably more so around a cash lineup.
Yeah, I think those plays, and I think just maybe going to Derrick Henry in some tournaments, I think is fine if you have a lot of entries in certain tournaments. Once again, he has had at least 18 opportunities in every game so far. The only thing is that he does have the lack of receiving work that kind of caps him out. But I mean, he does get the goal line touches. He's seen a lot of red zone opportunities. So if they're able to drive the ball with Tannehill and they're at the goal line or they're in red zone opportunities, we could see some upside there from Derrick Henry. But outside of that, I mean, there's pretty much it for that game. Baltimore, Seattle, Sal, we kind of jumped on it earlier in regards to speaking about Lockett and Carson. This game, you mentioned it. It's 49 over under. The spread 3.5 favorites for Seattle. Do we? It was 50.5 on Wednesday. It's dropped a 1.5 since the last 2 days. Do you think that's going to continue in that direction? Because it's like you said, is this game really shootout eligible and high scoring like it was originally projected?
Yeah, I'm not surprised that the total is coming down, and I would expect it to come down maybe another half a point to even a point. So Jimmy Smith, he limited practice all week. He was ruled officially now doubtful, so he's not going to be playing in this one. But they did get Marcus Peters, and we already mentioned that you're probably going to have Marlon Humphrey shadowing around Tyler Lockett even into the slot, which is just so much upside in terms of the passing game gone, especially when you factor in that Will Dissly is now in IR with the ruptured Achilles. So what that leaves you in terms of positive matchups is DK Metcalf on the outside. I don't think you'll have Peters on that left side of the field. I think you'll have Peters primarily stays on the right side of the field. So that shuts down Jerron Brown and David Moore or wherever the conversation or the combination of the wide receiver 3 is going to be. So yeah, when it comes down to just being DK Metcalf, sort of a one-trick pony running a lot of seam routes, I don't have much confidence in the passing game on that side. And then both teams' priorities should be trying to run the ball here. And that's how they're built, whether it's using Lamar as a runner as well or just the other 3 running backs in that backfield. And with no Hollywood Brown, it just leads it to Mark Andrews on the Baltimore side in terms of my interest. So I think Lamar is fine if you want to pay up in cash games and you do get that extra security in terms of a Chase Edmonds opening up to make more sense to pay up a quarterback in cash this week. But for the most part, it's just Mark Andrews for me and then Chris Carson from the Seattle side. If you want to watch just unreal in terms of 2 running backs from one game, last week, Nick Chubb and Chris Carson, if you watch their every play snaps, they were just putting on a clinic in terms of making like the first guy miss and just stiff arms left and right. It was absolutely unreal. So maybe that biases me a little bit, but I do think Chris Carson, I think this matchup is tougher than people expect, but just the workload, he's going to get 80+% of the snaps, it seems, and just on pace to see 20+ carries a game. You can't ignore that in a spot where the 6K range is kind of weak at running back.
Yeah, I mean, if they continue to feed him like they are, it's really hard to kind of, I guess, fade him in that instance, especially in a game where the weather might benefit him a little bit more for the ground and pound situation. I love the Carson play. Lockett, we talked about earlier, maybe not as aggressive as maybe the field is looking right now in regards to his ownership. How about the quarterbacks here? I mean, as far as Wilson and Jackson, is Jackson in play for another naked quarterback Lamar Jackson play like we've seen over the last few weeks?
Yeah, I think he is in play. He's facing a bottom 10 pressure team, and it might only get better for him if Ezekiel Ansah can't play in this game. So it seems like he's leaning towards not playing. That's another pass rush option that's going to be gone for a team that can't get pressure in Seattle, even with acquiring Jadeveon Clowney. So yeah, it's a good spot for Lamar. I think that if I do play him, I do want to play him with Mark Andrews, but there's no reason that you can't play a guy naked who's gone for over 120 yards on the ground in the first 2 out of these first 6 games for them. So yeah, Lamar's fine. And yeah, Russell Wilson, like I don't like Tyler Lockett. I don't want to pair him with DK. And then there's just nobody else to pair him with. So if you do go to Russell Wilson, for me, it's like probably getting to him in cash the most, but I know for a fact right now I'm not going to get there. So it's scary that I won't have Russell Wilson this week. But I just like the other quarterbacks around him. And when I kind of factor each of the individual matchups for the wide receivers and even the tight end Luke Wilson, it doesn't scare me as much because there's not beneficial spots there.
Last game, Sal, New Orleans at Chicago, over under 38.5. The lowest on the slate, Chicago 3.5-point favorites at home. It's the battle of the backup quarterbacks, Sal. So it's going to be an interesting way of how we look at this game. But Kamara's out. We got 2 backup quarterbacks in play. I mean, do you go anywhere as far as fantasy production, maybe outside of Michael Thomas on the Saints side?
Yeah, on the Saints side, no, not at all. So Kamara was the only other interest I had in this game. Now he's out. Jared Cook's out. Traquan Smith's out. It's literally just Ted Ginn Jr., Michael Thomas, and like Josh Hill going to be running this offense, and that's not great. So Michael Thomas should be seeing just overall more targets, and usually we like volume in terms of efficiency. It correlates a lot more for running backs, guys like Fournette and some of these other players that we've been seeing starting to break out, like a Josh Jacobs. When you get a ton of carries, eventually it'll swing your way. But for Michael Thomas, especially because he's still going to have Teddy Bridgewater throwing him the ball, you should see somewhere in the double digits of targets. Does that mean it's a huge week? It could be a decent week, 16, 18 fantasy points, but he is priced up. So I'm probably not touching the New Orleans Saints side of the ball at all. On the Chicago side, it seems like Mitch Trubisky is going to be back. That definitely helps Allen Robinson. Matchup for Allen Robinson, about half the game will be bad against Marshawn Lattimore, but then he'll be moved into the slot. He's playing a lot of his routes and running them out of the slot. About a third to 40% of his routes are out of the slot so far this year. If you're Matt Nagy and you know Marshawn Lattimore is on the outside, you should push him into the slot a lot more, but we don't know if that's actually going to happen. It probably won't by the end of the day. PJ Williams suspended 2 games for the Saints in the slot. So even, he's been terrible. So maybe not an even better matchup, but whoever his filling in can't be that great. So Allen Robinson is the spot on Chicago that I think I like the most in this entire game. That being said, it's just a wash spot. Like the ownership for each of my games that I get to, this will have by far the fewest.
You mentioned Marshawn Lattimore, and I mean, I think, yes, Marshawn Lattimore, very talented corner. 448 yards he's given up this year and 2 touchdowns to the wideout position. So, I mean, regardless, if he's on Allen Robinson's been seeing a lot of red zone looks. And is Trubisky officially back?
Yeah, so they said all week they were cautiously optimistic, and then he was a full participant in the last 2 practices. I think he's listed as questionable. I'll check on that right now, but all like the sentiment is that he's going to be playing.
Okay, because I mean, Allen Robinson's seen at least 7 targets every game. The last 3 or 4 games, he's seen 5 red zone targets. So, I mean, regardless of who's on him, I think on the Chicago side of the ball, maybe I like Allen Robinson. But out of that, I mean, a 30.5 over under, it's kind of really hard to want to roster anyone for fantasy purposes. How about the Chicago defense? Are they in play here with, Teddy Bridgewater still in here as a quarterback?
Yeah, they definitely are. I think that both sides, even with Mitch Trubisky back, I mean, he wasn't great when he was in there for the 2.5 games or so. So I think both sides of this game, the defenses are in play. I might even like the Saints defense a little bit more. But yeah, with no Kamara and then Cook to an extent, not being there for the Saints, it makes the Bears defense even better of a play. The only downside that you can say is that they're not forcing Teddy Bridgewater to do anything downfield or anything he doesn't feel comfortable with. So in terms of like turnovers being there, he's been very good at not turning the ball over. And obviously you need turnovers, but this Bears pressure is going to be the strongest pressure that he's faced yet. So yeah, both defenses in play for sure in this game. And they're both at a very favorable price point. I think one's 3K, one's 2,900. So I think those are probably honestly the two spots that I would want to get to the most in the game.
All right. That's it, guys, for the Week 7 DFS NFL Final Thoughts show with Sal and I here at Awesemo.com. What we do in the last few moments, if you guys want to ask any questions, go ahead and do so. We'll go ahead and round this out. But once again, we just want to thank our sponsor at Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports. And once again, guys, if you're looking to get involved with Awesemo.com, use the tools and resources, get access to all and everything that Alex Baker, Awesemo himself, the #1 player in the world, uses. Use the code NFL Strategy. Go to the NFL landing page on Awesemo.com. There's a bunch of cool videos there that kind of break down everything that you're receiving and knowing what you're getting before you actually go ahead and buy. But as far as questions, Sal, I'm looking here, seeing if there's anything. Not seeing too much here. Other than that, yeah, I guess we'll go ahead. Someone said Ted Ginn, Sal.
Yeah, no interest in Ted Ginn against the Bears. I know he had like one long touchdown, but whether it's Drew Brees or Bridgewater, this team maybe once a game, twice if you're lucky, will throw more than 20 yards down the field. So I think you could do a lot better. I don't even know. Ted Ginn's price, I think right now is like in that 3K range. So I imagine that's why it's being asked. But 3,600, yeah, it's not a spot that I want to get to. I understand that it's a pricing type thing, probably why you're trying to fit him in there. But I don't think there's much upside.
All right, Josh Allen or Kyler Murray in cash?
Yeah, very close to each other in price. It's going to be Kyler Murray for me. They both have that rushing upside on the ground. I think Kyler Murray, even though Josh Allen's facing Miami, I think he'll have just more sustained upside, if that makes sense. So Josh Allen could have a huge first half. And then like we've seen in weeks past with Dak or Lamar Jackson, the second half slows down because the running game takes over. So I think they're both good for cash. I think I prefer Kyler Murray there.
Devin Singletary.
Yeah, Devin Singletary back. Look, the price point's not where I wanted. Like, I love Devin Singletary as a player, but Devin Singletary in the mid 5K range. I've said it. I've harped on it a couple times this show. I prefer Josh Jacobs. We'll see what happens with Edmonds. I might even prefer Tevin Coleman for a guy who will probably see a similar, if not better, split in terms of Coleman. So I get it. It's Miami. They've been getting hammered on the ground. They're not the worst run defense. They're actually like 11th in the league in run defense. The only reason they look worse is teams are just running 35 times a game on them because they're ahead. So it's not as much of they're getting gashed left and right. It's just a volume thing at that point, and then they're just below average at guarding it. So Singletary, not for me this week. I don't even know if he'll see more than 50% of the snaps.
Is Ridley a good GBP play?
Oh, yeah. Ridley's a really good play this week. And I guess we can leave it at that. But Calvin Ridley this week is the guy in the Atlanta passing game that I want to prioritize the most.
Any love for Cole Beasley?
No love for Cole Beasley.
Josh Jacobs, GBP?
Yeah, Josh Jacobs is in a really good spot. So we'll see with Kenny Clark. Kenny Clark is probably the Packers' best defensive front player against the run. Dean Lowry's been playing well, but they lost Mike Daniels to the Lions this offseason right before the season started. But Josh Jacobs coming out of the bye. And the thing that benefits him the most, look, they're going to have Trent Brown probably out, best offensive lineman for sure. That's not great. But what benefits him the most is Vegas, these wide receivers for the Packers, all their injuries have moved the line down from 7 to 4.5. So instead of it being a negative game script going in, it seems more so like a neutral game script. So I like Josh Jacobs at that price point a lot. It's going to get all thrown up and messed up if we get Chase Edmonds news tomorrow at 11:30. But yeah, Josh Jacobs I like in either format.
Frank Gore or Devin Singletary?
Yeah, that's actually a good question if you want to play them. If I could answer none, I would, but I imagine that some of these questions are like season-long based. Frank Gore is cheaper, and we've been seeing him get the work. But in the past couple of weeks, it's been like TJ Yeldon getting more snaps. So if Singletary is fully back, I prefer Singletary for the upside there.
And what about your favorite low-owned play?
Favorite low-owned play? That's a good question. I was looking at ownership a ton. I have like a list of like 20 guys' ownerships written down. I guess low owned play, like for leverage opportunities for like a huge ceiling, not just a guy to get you 15 points. I think that Keenan Allen's a very good leverage spot this week. That doesn't mean that I think he's like a smash to score 20, but a guy like Keenan Allen being 6% owned the first time since week 1 when he dropped 29 points, I do think it's a good spot against a Tennessee defense that for the most part will funnel you to throw it short into the middle of the field where Keenan Allen should be for the far majority of that game. That's just one that comes to mind right off the top. But there's a lot of guys around that 9% range like Kenny Golladay and DJ Shark that I think are a little bit too low owned this week. But yeah, those are some names that come to mind.
And then I guess we'll see How do you like Murray against Bears without Hicks and GBP?
Yeah, so Hicks is the reason that well, not the main reason they got up early in some short fields that Josh Jacobs had a good game, but Hicks being out for I think like more around a month or so more now, in the middle of that Bears defensive front, that's an issue. So it does prop up Murray a little bit. The concern for me there is that relative to the slate, he's not cheap. He's not 3,700 like he was last week. He's 5,100, and there's like 3 or 4 other backs in that range, even cheaper than him, that I'd rather get to than Murray. So the guy should have the bulk of the work, but it's a really bad matchup, even with Hicks out and relative to the slate. I'm just not going to get to Murray.
And then Niners or Bills defense? I love that question.
Yeah, so they're both really expensive, right? They're both like the top defenses. Yeah, they're both the top 2. So like personally, I'm probably not going to get to much of either of them just because I don't pay up that much. If I had to pick one, it would be the Bills defense at home. Like the Bills at home, in a beneficial matchup is the best spot for a defense to be playing in Buffalo. So when they're a huge favorite, yeah, I like the matchup a lot for the Bills.
All right, and then we'll go do 2 more questions. DJ Shark and Fournette, same lineup FanDuel. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's the main question. I think it's okay, but having if you're playing one lineup, I think it's okay. If you're having a ton of lineups, I don't think you want too many of that combination. But that's the struggle I'm having. I like both players a lot, and the amount that I like Fournette right now is not getting to as much Shark as I want. But yeah, I think both of them together is fine.
And then Scary Terry and Hyde for James Conner or D. Henry. I'd get Conner or Henry.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, guys, we're going to go ahead and close this out. Don't forget, coming up a little bit later on, Alex Baker, the number 1 player in himself, the number 1 player in the world himself, and Matt Harmon, football writer and analyst for Yahoo Sports, who's also the creator of Reception Perception. They're going to be doing a live stream. I believe that's at 2:00, right, Sal?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, don't forget to go ahead and check out that stream. You guys, there's 502 in here right now. Only 19 likes and thumbs up. Let's go ahead and get that up because guess what? We want to come back next week and do this again. Sal, always a pleasure. Where can we go ahead and find you outside of this stream?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at SalVetriDFS. I have a YouTube channel that's just also like stripped down the audio into a podcast version if that's more effective for people. You can just search my name, Sal Vetri, on really any platform, and that'll come up. And then, yeah, I'm here on Awesemo Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturdays at 11 a.m. And starting next week on Wednesdays, I'll be there with Josh in the mornings for the NBA season.
All right. And for myself, at Chris Randone, go ahead and catch me on Twitter. You guys, we wish you nothing but the best of luck tomorrow. Go ahead and don't forget, play good players, trust the process, go with your gut, and always know that if it doesn't work out tomorrow, there's always next week. But if we don't win the Millionaire Maker, we hope one of you guys do. It was a pleasure, guys. Have a great weekend and good luck.